His father knelt beside the tool shed and pressed his thumb into the gap between the kiln wall and the wooden brace. White lime dust floated in the air. The brick glowed dull red 3 inches away, hot enough to scorch hair, but the wood under his father's hand was only warm. "Feel that," his father said, and pushed the boy's finger into the space. Air moved upward against his skin, warm but bearable. "Heat needs a road," his father said. "Break the road." 30 years later, the boy was a man with a sick child in a plank box on the open Kansas prairie, and the road was burning. Warren Dorr arrived on the claim north of Walnut Creek in the last week of March 1894 with a borrowed handcart, a 9-year-old girl who was not his daughter, and $3.80 folded inside a tobacco tin. The girl was Elsie, his sister's child. His sister had died in Hays 11 days earlier, a fever that started in her chest and finished in her brain, and there was no one else. No aunt in Missouri willing to take a child with a cough, no uncle with room, no passage money east, and no promise of work if he got there. Warren had a deed path on 160 acres of Kansas grass, a debt note for salvaged lumber held by a man named Chet Fallner, and a single wall plank shack he had not seen since October. The handcart held everything: 1 sack of flour, 30 pounds, 1 shovel with a cracked handle wrapped in wire, 1 dull crosscut saw missing 2 teeth, a wool blanket that smelled like the freight wagon that carried them from Hays, a tin cookpot. A Bible Elsie's mother had pressed into her hands the morning she stopped recognizing faces. Elsie walked beside the cart without complaint. She had not cried since the burial. Warren did not know whether that meant strength or shock, and he did not ask because asking would require him to have an answer if she broke, and he had no answers for anyone, including himself. The shack stood where he had left it, 12 feet by 16, single-wall pine boards nailed to a rough frame, tar paper seams patched with flour paste that had cracked and peeled over the winter. The roof was split cedar shakes over pole rafters. It stopped rain mostly, but Warren could see light through 3 gaps where the wind had shifted boards. There was no ceiling. The interior was 1 room, a plank floor, warped in the middle where moisture had pooled, a stovepipe hole in the north wall, but the stove itself was a borrowed piece he had returned before leaving for Hays. No shade tree within a 1/4 mile. No porch. No overhang. The shack sat on open prairie like a box someone had dropped and forgotten. He pulled the handcart to the door and stopped. Elsie looked at the shack, then at him, then back at the shack. "Is this the house?" she asked. "This is it," Warren said. She nodded once. She picked up the Bible and carried it inside. Warren stood in the March wind and felt the first real weight of what he had done. He had brought a child to a plank box on a treeless claim with no stove, no well curb, no garden started, no neighbor closer than Clara Bixby's place 1.5 miles east, and a debt note that gave Chet Fallner a lien on the only shelter they had. He could not leave. Leaving meant losing the claim. Losing the claim meant losing the shack. Losing the shack meant he had a 9-year-old girl and no roof in any direction. The Homestead Act required residence and improvement, and Warren had done barely enough of either to keep the filing alive. If he abandoned now, Fallner would buy the relinquishment for nothing, and Warren would be a broke man with a child in a town that had no use for either of them. He unloaded the cart. He patched the worst roof gap with a piece of the flour sack. He swept mouse droppings out the door with a bundle of dead grass. Elsie sat on the blanket in the corner and opened the Bible to a random page and stared at it without reading. $3.80, 30 pounds of flour. No stove, no seed, no team, no credit except what Fallner might extend, and Fallner's credit came with teeth. Warren knelt beside the west wall and pressed his palm flat against the pine boards. The wood was cold in March. In 5 months, it would not be cold. In 5 months, under full Kansas sun, these boards would hold heat like a stove lid, and the inside of this shack would become the kind of place that killed old people and children. He knew this because he had spent the previous summer here alone, sleeping on the ground outside because the shack after sundown was worse than the open air. He had survived that. But he had been alone, and he had been stronger then, before the winter fever that had settled in his chest and never fully left. Now he had Elsie. And Elsie was 9 years old and thin in a way that made her wrists look like kindling. The first hot spell came in the second week of April. It was not summer heat, not yet, but a 3-day stretch of dry southwest wind that pushed the afternoon temperature past 85 and turned the shack into a demonstration of everything wrong with single-wall pine construction. The boards soaked up sun on the west and south faces. By mid-afternoon, Warren could feel warmth radiating from the inside wall surface. By evening, the stored heat pushed back into the room like a slow exhale. The shack did not cool until well past midnight. Elsie handled the first day. The second day she went quiet and pale and sat with her back against the east wall, which caught shade in the afternoon. The third day she fainted. Warren carried her outside and laid her in the shadow of the handcart, which was the only shadow available. He wet a rag from the water bucket and pressed it to her neck. Her pulse was fast and thin under his fingers. Her skin was dry. He was still holding the rag to her neck when Dr. Orrin Kells rode up the track. Kells was 56, the county physician, a former Army surgeon who had kept his medical bag and his opinions through 2 decades of Kansas practice. He had come because Clara Bixby had told him a man had brought a child to the door claim, and Kells made rounds to new arrivals when he could, especially when children were involved. He tied his horse to the handcart post and walked to where Warren crouched over Elsie. He did not greet Warren. He knelt, pressed 2 fingers to the girl's wrist, lifted one eyelid, then the other, and looked at the shack the way a man looks at a thing he is about to condemn. "How long has she been like this?" Kells asked. "She went down an hour ago," Warren said. "She was fine at breakfast." Kells looked at the shack again. He stood and walked to the west wall and placed his palm on the boards, the same gesture Warren had made in March. But Kells did it with the diagnostic precision of a man who had seen what heat did to people who could not escape it. "Where's your shade porch?" Kells asked. "I don't have one." "Your dugout?" "No dugout." "Your soddy?" "No." Kells turned and looked at Warren the way you look at a man who has brought a child to an open fire and seemed surprised she burned. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His calm was worse than shouting. "Mr. Dorr, this structure has no ceiling, no overhang, no shade on any face, and single wall boards that take sun all day. A sod house is cooler in summer by 15 degrees or more. A dugout cut into the north bank of a draw stays cool enough to keep milk from turning. A porch on the south and west with a 3-foot overhang will cut the worst afternoon radiation. You have none of these things. What you have is a pine box." Warren said nothing. He knew. Kells crouched beside Elsie again and checked her pulse a second time. Satisfied she was recovering, he poured water from Warren's bucket onto the rag without asking and reapplied it to her forehead. "Can you dig a dugout?" Kells asked. "The draw floods in spring rain. The bank is sand over clay." "Can you cut sod?" Warren looked at the cracked shovel leaning against the handcart. He looked at his own chest, which had not expanded to full breadth since January. He said, "Not alone, not in time." "Then build the porch, lumber, poles, brush shade. South and west walls 3 feet of overhang minimum. Lumber comes from Fallner's yard, Warren said. Kells paused. He understood what that meant. Everyone in the county understood what dealing with Chet Fallner meant. Then find another way, Kells said. Because this, he pointed at the shack. A thin box is not a house in this country. It is a coffin waiting for weather. He left instructions. Keep the girl out of the shack between 10 in the morning and 4 in the afternoon. Hang wet cloth over the window if there was one. Dig a shallow hole in the ground on the north side and let her rest there in the worst hours. Drink more water than seemed necessary. Watch for dry skin, confusion, fast pulse. And, Mr. Dorr, Kells said as he mounted, she cannot take a full summer of this. Children are not made for what you are asking that box to hold. He rode south toward Clara Bixby's place without looking back. Warren sat beside Elsie until she opened her eyes and asked for water. He gave her the cup and watched her drink, and he did not tell her what Kells had said because Elsie was 9 and she already knew the shack was an oven. She did not need a doctor's words to confirm what her own body had told her when the room went gray and the floor came up to meet her face. That evening, Warren walked to the store in La Crosse. It took him 2 hours. He bought 6 pounds of cornmeal and a box of matches and listened to the men on the porch talk about the dry spring and the wheat price and the wells dropping west of the creek. Chet Fallner was there. Fallner was 48. The lumber dealer, the note holder, the man who had sold Warren the salvaged boards for the shack at a price that included interest folded into interest until the debt was a living thing that grew while Warren slept. Fallner bought distressed claims. He extended credit to settlers he expected to fail, then purchased their improvements at a fraction of the cost when they walked away. It was legal. It was common. It was the way a man built a lumber business in a county where cash was scarce and desperation was not. Fallner saw Warren and smiled the way a man smiles at a thing he already owns. Dorr, heard you brought a girl out to that box. My niece, Warren said. My sister passed. Sorry to hear that. Fallner did not sound sorry. You know, I could take the claim off your hands. Save you the trouble. $8 cash for the relinquishment, and you walk free of the note. $8. The claim was 160 acres. The shack alone, worthless as it was, had cost Warren more than $8 in materials and sweat. Fallner's offer was not charity. It was the sound a trap makes before it closes. I'm keeping the claim, Warren said. Fallner shrugged. Suit yourself, but when the girl faints again, and she will... Remember I offered. Warren carried the cornmeal home in the dark. The wind had shifted north, and the night was cool, and the shack had finally stopped radiating the day's heat. Elsie was asleep on the blanket. Warren sat on the step and looked at the sky and counted the things he did not have. No stove, no shade, no lumber for a porch, no credit that did not come with a lien, no sod-cutting strength, no well curb, no garden, no help. He counted the things he did have, a shovel, a saw, hands time before August, and the knowledge that Elsie could not survive what was coming inside those walls. And one other thing. He had noticed it without thinking, the way a man notices a thing so common it barely registers. On the walk to the store, he had passed 3 stone culverts, 2 limestone fence posts, and a ledge outcrop where the road cut through a low rise. At noon, the only cool air he had felt all day was in the narrow space between stacked fence rock and the earth behind it. Not cold, not remarkable. Just a strip of air that moved differently than the open prairie, as if the stone had caught the sun's attention and the air behind it had been left alone. He did not have an idea yet. He had a question. Why was the air behind the stone cooler than the air anywhere else? The question kept him up that night and followed him into the morning. Warren left Elsie with water and cornmeal mush and walked the claim, not looking at the shack but at the ground. North of the creek draw, where the land rose toward a low bench, limestone broke the surface in pale shelves and scattered rubble. Post-rock country. The stone ran in layers through the earth like pages in a book. Some pieces were flat, the size of a man's chest, worn smooth on one face. Others were rough. It's the size of a fist broken from frost and rain. There was more stone on his claim than he could move in a year. He picked up a flat piece and carried it back to the shack. He leaned it against the west wall, 6 inches out from the boards, propped on 2 smaller rocks. Then he sat and watched the sun move. By afternoon, the stone face was warm, hot even. But the board behind it, the 6 inches of air between stone and pine, was different. Warren pressed his palm to the pine. It was not cool exactly, but it was not the iron skillet heat of the unshielded boards 3 feet away. Something happened in that gap. The air was moving, rising, pulling a draft from the ground. He tried other tests. He hung a grain sack on the west wall to block sun. By afternoon, it was blistering hot and pressed flat against the boards. No gap, no air. He propped dead brush against the south face. Wind tore it apart in 2 hours. He tried mud plaster. It cracked by evening as the boards flexed with temperature. Every attempt that touched the wall failed. The only thing that had worked was the thing that did not touch it. The stone. The gap. That night, sitting on the doorstep, he remembered the lime yard. He had been 12. His father worked a lime kiln operation outside Jefferson City, Missouri, hauling stone and raking ash. The kilns burned hot enough to calcine limestone, and the wooden sheds where tools were stored sat dangerously close to the kiln walls. Warren remembered the white dust that settled in his eyelashes. He remembered the scorched hair smell when wind shifted wrong. He remembered the shimmer of heat above the brick. And he remembered his father's hand. His father had knelt beside one of the tool sheds and pressed his thumb into the gap between the hot kiln wall and the wooden brace. The brace was warm, but not burning. The kiln brick, 3 inches away, was too hot to touch. "Feel that?" his father had said, pushing Warren's small finger into the gap. Air moved upward against his skin, warm but bearable. "Heat needs a road," his father had said. "Stone to air to wood, that's a road. Break the road, and the heat can't find the wood as fast." Warren had filed this the way a child files things, without understanding, without forgetting. 30 years later, sitting on a doorstep in Kansas with a sick niece and a coffin box for shelter, the memory unfolded like a map. Not a stone house. He could not build a stone house alone, not a porch. He had no lumber and no credit, not mud plaster, not brush, not sod. Something else. A second wall, a stone screen around the shack, not touching it, standing in the sun so the boards did not have to. The stone would take the heat. The air in the gap would rise and carry warmth upward and out. The pine boards would sit in permanent shade, 6 inches from a furnace, but separated from it by a road that heat could not easily cross. He drew it on a flour sack with a charcoal stub, the shack in the center. A continuous ring of dry stacked limestone around it, 2 feet thick at the base, battering slightly inward, rising 5 to 6 feet, higher on the south and west where the sun hit hardest. 6 inches of air gap, measured by a hand-cut spacer stick. Open slots at the bottom every 4 feet, angled with flat stones to keep snakes and mice out, but let cooler ground-level air enter. Open at the top, no cap, no seal against the shack wall, so the heated air rising through the gap could escape. The stone would be the sacrificial skin. The air gap would be the broken road. The shack would sit inside like a body behind a shield. He stared at the drawing. It was insane. 2 long walls, 2 short walls, returns at the door to form a shaded entry throat, all dry stacked without mortar, all hauled by hand from the outcrop a quarter-mile north. Thousands of stones. He had no wagon. He had a hand cart and a cracked shovel and a chest that wheezed when he bent over, but it used the one material that existed in surplus on his claim: limestone, free, already broken into movable pieces by 1,000 winters, available in quantities that made the task possible if only the body could hold. He did not tell Elsie yet. He told the flour sack, and the flour sack did not laugh. Clara Bixby saw the stakes first. Warren had driven sharpened sticks in a ring around the shack, 6 inches from the boards, marking the line of the outer wall. Clara rode over on her mule the next morning, her 2 boys walking behind, and stopped at the edge of the claim. "What are the stakes for?" she called. "Stone wall," Warren said. Clara dismounted and walked the perimeter. She counted the stakes. She looked at the distance from the boards, barely the width of her hand. She looked at Warren, who weighed perhaps 140 pounds, and coughed when he straightened too fast. "Warren, how many stones is this?" He had calculated. The perimeter was roughly 56 running feet, 2 feet thick, 5 to 6 feet high. He needed approximately 4 stones per square foot of wall face, with rubble harding between the outer faces. He said, "More than I want to count." "How long?" "Before August." Clara looked at the stakes again. She looked at the shack, which was already warm in the mid-morning sun. She looked at Elsie, who stood in the doorway holding a cup of water. "Warren." Clara's voice was not cruel. It was the voice of a woman who had buried a husband on the prairie and raised 2 boys on a homestead that tried to kill her every season. "By the time you finish making shade, summer will have already killed the garden. You won't have a well curb. You won't have seed in the ground. You won't have stovepipe for cooking. You'll have a rock ring around a hot box and nothing to eat inside it." Warren did not argue. He walked to the west wall, where his test stone still leaned against the boards. He pulled it aside. "Put your hand here," he said, pointing to the board behind where the stone had stood. Clara pressed her palm to the wood. She moved it 3 feet to the left, where the sun had hit all morning. She looked at Warren. "That's 1 stone," she said. "You need 10,000. "I know." She shook her head. "You're going to kill yourself hauling rock, and the girl's going to watch." She remounted the mule and left. She did not say he was stupid. She said he was going to die, which was worse because it sounded like she believed it. The mockery started the following week. Warren began hauling stone before dawn, dragging the handcart north to the outcrop, loading flat pieces and rough S, dragging it back, sorting the load beside the staked perimeter. 40 stones before breakfast, 80 before noon when his lungs allowed it. Some mornings the cough bent him double and the count stopped at 30. People noticed. The road to La Crosse passed close enough to the claim that anyone heading to the store could see a thin man in a sweat-dark shirt stacking pale rock in a circle around a shack that was already too small to be worth protecting. At first they assumed he was building a fence. Fences made sense. Post-rock fences were common in the county. Settlers quarried limestone for fence posts where wood was scarce, and everyone understood the logic. But a fence runs in a line. Warren's stones curved around the shack in a tight orbit, 6 inches from the walls, like something trying to swallow the building whole. Chet Fallner named it. Standing outside his lumberyard with two men from the creek settlement, he watched Warren's handcart pass on the road, loaded with stone, and said loud enough to carry, "Doors building a paranoid rock fence." The phrase was perfect in its cruelty. It was easy to say, easy to remember, easy to repeat. Within a week, everyone between the creek and the store used it. Men on wagons slowed to watch Warren work and shook their heads. A group of children from the creek settlement counted his stones in a sing-song chant until Clara Bixby's eldest boy chased them off. Someone, Warren never learned who, left a scrap of paper wedged in his door. "Sun can climb." The mockery stung, but it was Fallner's next move that drew blood. Warren went to the store to buy nails. He needed roof bracing before summer. The cedar shakes were shifting, and if rain came before the stone wall was finished, a leaking roof would rot the only shelter Elsie had. He asked Fallner for a pound of 10-penny nails on short credit. Fallner leaned against the yard fence and looked at the small pile of sorted stones on Warren's handcart. "I'll extend credit for lumber," Fallner said. "Porch lumber, enough to shade the south and west. Good boards, not the trash you've got now. I'll write it against the note you already owe, plus 10%, and if you miss one payment, I take the claim. Fair terms." "I don't want porch lumber," Warren said. "I want a pound of nails." "Nails I sell for cash." Fallner smiled. "Or you sign the default clause. Your choice." Warren stood in the yard and felt the trap's shape. Fallner did not want him to build a porch. Fallner wanted the default clause. The porch was the excuse. The claim was the prize. Every dollar of credit Fallner extended was a thread in a net designed to land Warren on the road with nothing. "I'll find nails somewhere else," Warren said. Fallner stepped forward and kicked one of Warren's sorted stones off the handcart. It hit the dust and rolled. "You're hauling rocks around a cracker box while your girl cooks inside it. When she faints again, and she will remember you chose rocks over boards." Warren bent down. He picked up the stone. He turned it in his hands, feeling the flat bed on one side, the rough break on the other. He placed it back on the handcart, straightened the rest of the load, and pulled the cart toward the road without saying a word. His silence was not defeat. It was not pride. It was the sound of a man who had no proof and no argument and no ally, and who kept working because working was the only language he had left. Construction began in earnest the first week of April. Warren set a system and held to it with the stubbornness of a man who understood that discipline was the only substitute for strength. Dawn. Walk to the outcrop, load the cart, drag it back, sort the stones into 3 piles, flat faces for the outer skin, irregular S's for the interior harding, round creek stones set aside because they would not sit stable. 40 stones before breakfast, cornmeal mush with Elsie, back to the outcrop. 80 stones by noon on good days. On bad days, when the cough turned his vision gray at the edges, he stopped at 60 and sat with his back against the growing pile and breathed until the world steadied. He started with the west wall because the west face took the worst afternoon sun. He dug a shallow trench 2 feet wide, 4 inches deep, to seat the base course. He laid the first stones with the spacer stick, a piece of board cut to exactly 6 inches, held between the stone face and the pine wall. Base course, heavy, flat stones, wide enough to support the weight above. Second course, staggered joints, smaller stones wedging the gaps. The first 5 courses went up in 3 days. Warren stepped back and looked at the beginning of his wall. It was 2.5 feet high, rough-faced, leaning very slightly outward in a way that made his stomach clench. The stones did not look like they belonged together. They looked like rubble that a man had piled against a wall because he had lost his mind. Then, on the fourth day, a section of the west wall leaned too far. A rounded creek stone he had used as fill shifted under the weight of the course above it. The outer face bulged. Warren heard the scrape of stone on stone, a sound like teeth grinding, and jumped back as 8 stones tumbled outward and hit the ground in a cloud of dust. One stone clipped his ankle. He sat in the dirt and held his boot and watched the collapsed section with the sick certainty that Clara had been right. He could not do this. He did not know how to stack stone. He was a railroad loading hand and a lime yard laborer. He knew how to carry weight, not how to make it stand. He was still sitting there when Tollef Asen came up the track. Tollef was 63, Norwegian-born, a post-rock quarryman who had spent 30 years cutting and stacking limestone in this country, building fence posts and house walls and root cellar arches for settlers who needed stone because they had no trees. He was short, wide in the shoulders, and his hands were mapped with scars from drill steel and wedge iron. He walked with a slight limp from a quarry fall a decade earlier, and he carried a stone hammer in a loop on his belt the way other men carried a knife. He had been watching Warren from the road for 3 days, not stopping, not speaking, just watching the way a man watches someone do a thing he knows how to do and doing it wrong. Now he stopped. He looked at the collapsed section. He looked at the rounded creek stone that had caused the failure. He picked it up and held it in one hand, turning it. "This one has no bed," Tollef said. Warren looked up. "What?" Tollef set the round stone aside and picked up a flat piece from Warren's sorted pile. He held it so Warren could see the broad, level surface on the bottom. "Bed." He flipped it. "Faith." He pointed to the collapsed section. "You put a stone with no bed under 3 courses of weight. It rolled. The wall followed." It was not a greeting. It was not an introduction. It was a diagnosis, delivered with the calm of a man who had seen 1,000 walls and knew why each one fell. Warren stood up, wincing on the bruised ankle. "I don't have money for a stone mason." "I did not offer to sell anything." Tollef set the flat stone on the ground, bed down, and tapped it once with his palm. "I said this one has no bed. That is free." He stayed for 2 hours that first afternoon. He did not rebuild the collapsed section. He made Warren do it, correcting each stone placement with a grunt or a nod or a single word. Turn. Wider. Bed. He taught 3 things before he left. First, sorting. Every stone has a bed, a face, and a back. Flat stones with clear beds go on the outer faces. Irregular stones fill the heart between the 2 faces. Round stones are nearly useless. Use them only as locked fill deep inside, trapped between flat pieces that keep them from rolling. Second, batter. The wall must lean slightly inward, not stand vertical like a box. A vertical dry stone wall pushes outward under its own weight. A battered wall pushes inward, and gravity holds it together. Third, through stones. Long stones must reach from one face to the other, tying the wall together like bones in a body. Without them, the 2 outer faces will separate under pressure. He said one more thing before leaving. Your vents, bottom and top. If you seal the gap, the air stops. Then you have built an oven, not a shade. He did not ask Warren to explain the design. He had looked at the stakes, the spacer stick, the open bottom, and he understood what Warren was attempting. He did not say it would work. He did not say it was clever. He picked up his stone hammer and walked back toward the road, limping slightly on the left side. Warren watched him go and felt something shift in his chest that was not the cough. It was the first time since arriving that someone had looked at his work and spoken about it as if it were real. The next morning, Tollef came back. If you have ever been mocked for building something nobody understood yet, tell us in the comments. Warren had no proof to offer them, only another stone to lift. By the end of the second week of April, the west wall stood 3 feet high. Warren could see the line of it from the road now, a pale ridge of limestone wrapping the shack's worst face. The stones were better sorted. The batter was visible, a gentle inward lean that Tolliff checked every evening by sighting down the wall with one eye closed. The through stones appeared every 4 feet, long, flat pieces that reached from outer face to inner face, locking the wall into a single mass. But the south wall was only a trench. The east was a pile of unsorted stone. The north had not been started, and the calendar was burning. Warren marked his progress on the door frame with charcoal. West base course, done. West wall, 3 feet, done. South trench, half dug. North, nothing. East, nothing. He looked at the marks every morning and calculated the gap between what existed and what he needed, and the gap did not close. It widened because his body was slower each week, and the stones did not get lighter, and summer did not wait. His palms cracked first. The limestone edges opened his skin in thin cuts that wept clear fluid and would not close because he could not stop lifting. He wrapped his hands in strips torn from the flour sack and kept working. The wraps turned dark with dust and blood by noon. Elsie saw them and said nothing, but she started carrying water from the draw in a lard pail so Warren would not have to make the extra trip. She was 9 years old, carrying water in Kansas heat for a man building a wall out of faith in limestone and a dead man's memory. And she did not complain, which made it worse, because Warren could see in her thin wrists the same fragility that Kells had measured with his fingers, and he knew that every hour she spent carrying water was an hour she spent in the sun that the wall was supposed to protect her from. The cough worsened in the last week of April. A morning came when Warren could not straighten from the outcrop without black spots swimming in his vision. He sat against a limestone ledge and coughed until his ribs ached and his mouth tasted like rust. He loaded 30 stones that day instead of 80. The west wall gained 1 course, the calendar lost another day, and the heat was coming. The mornings were warmer now. The midday sun had teeth. Elsie's lips chapped and split. The draw where they hauled water dropped an inch in 1 week. The store thermometer in La Crosse read 91 on the last day of April, and the men on the porch said it was the warmest April close they could remember, and they said it the way men say things they wish they did not believe. Warren stood at his door that evening and looked at the half-finished west wall, the empty trenches where the other 3 walls should have been, the pile of unsorted stone that seemed to grow smaller every day no matter how many loads he hauled. Tolliff had not come that day. The wind carried dust and the smell of dry grass, and somewhere on the plain a coyote made a sound that could have been laughter. The wall was not enough, not yet, not nearly, and the heat was not waiting. Guide 2 continues. Tolliff came every morning after that first week. He did not announce himself. He appeared on the track with his stone hammer on his belt and his limp and his silence, and he worked beside Warren until the sun passed its peak, and then he left. He never explained why he came. Warren never asked. The question felt dangerous, as if naming the help might break whatever obligation or curiosity or stubbornness kept bringing the old quarryman back to a claim that was not his, to build a wall for a man who could not pay him. What Tolliff taught, he taught through stone. He did not lecture. He picked up a piece, turned it, set it, and waited for Warren to see what he had done. When Warren placed a stone wrong, Tolliff did not correct him with words. He lifted the stone, held it in front of Warren's face, and turned it until the bed was visible. Then he set it back in Warren's hands and pointed at the wall. The sorting became a language. Flatbeds along the bottom courses, where weight concentrated. Tapered stones at the corners, where the south wall met the west, each one cut to an angle by frost and laid so the taper locked the turn. Parting stones, the rough, ugly pieces that filled the interior, packed tight between the faces so no single stone could shift without moving its neighbors. And the through stones, long and flat, reaching from outer face to inner face every 4 feet, binding the wall into one body the way a timber beam ties a frame. Tolliff taught Warren to build a shade gauge. He took a scrap board from the shack's waste pile, cut it to 18 inches, and mounted it on a stick driven into the ground behind the wall, level with the window head. At noon, Tolliff checked the gauge. If sunlight touched the board, the wall was too low at that point, or the corner was too far from the shack, or the angle was wrong. The gauge turned construction into measurement. Warren could see, in a stripe of light or shadow on a pine board, whether his work was protecting the wall behind it. "Sun moves," Tolliff said one afternoon, the most words he had spoken in 3 days. "Wall does not. Build for the worst angle, not the noon angle." Warren adjusted the south wall's height by 8 inches based on the gauge. 8 inches meant another course of stone across 20 feet of wall, another 60 stones hauled, sorted, and placed. His back informed him of the cost in a vocabulary of stiffness and heat that began at his kidneys and spread to his shoulders by evening. May arrived with wind. The southwest gusts came steady and warm, carrying dust that coated the stone faces and filled Warren's lungs with grit. But the wind did something worse than dust. It packed tumbleweed and dead grass into the air gap between the stone wall and the shack boards. Warren found the west cavity stuffed with dried stems one morning, so tight in places that the 6-inch space had become a solid mat of fuel wedged against pine. The realization hit like a slap. If a prairie fire threw a spark, or if a hot wind knocked a cook fire ember sideways, the gap between his stone shield and his wooden shelter would become a chimney packed with kindling. He had built a fire trap. Tolliff came that morning and saw Warren on his knees, raking the cavity with a bent hoe handle, pulling fistfuls of grass and weed from the base vents. Tolliff watched without speaking for several minutes. Then he took a flat stone from the sorted pile and set it at an angle across one of the base vents, leaving the air path open but deflecting the direct wind entry. "Every evening," Tolliff said, "rake it every evening, and set clean-out points." He showed Warren how to leave certain base stones loose, not mortared, not wedged, just resting in place, so they could be pulled out and the cavity cleared from the bottom. It was unglamorous work. It made the wall less elegant, less finished, more like a thing that required tending, but it kept the gap open and the fire risk manageable. The wall was not magic, it was maintenance. That distinction mattered, and Warren wrote it on the flour sack beside his charcoal drawing. Clear the gap. Every day. By mid-May, the west wall stood 5 feet high. The south wall reached Warren's shoulder. The east wall was 2 feet of base course, rough and gapped, barely started. The north wall was a trench with 12 stones laid in it. Dr. Kells returned. He rode up the track on a Tuesday morning and stopped his horse and looked at the stone wrapping the shack. His face showed nothing. He dismounted and walked the perimeter without speaking, running his hand along the top course of the west wall, peering into the gap at the base vents, pressing his palm to the pine boards behind the stone. "Where did you learn this?" Kells asked. "Limeyard," Warren said. "Missouri." Kells looked at the air gap. He looked at the open top where the stone wall ended and the shack wall continued bare above it. He looked at the east wall, 2 feet high and useless. "Stone holds heat," Kells said. "You know that." "Yes. After sundown, that wall will release everything it stored during the day. If the gap is too narrow, or if the top is closed, or if the wind dies and the convection stops, you will have wrapped your shack in a heat battery. The stones will radiate warmth into the cavity all night. The boards will absorb it. The interior will be worse than it was without the wall. Warren had thought about this. He had lain awake thinking about it. Kells was not wrong. The fear that the wall would become an oven instead of a shield was the doubt that lived in Warren's chest beside the cough. The top is open, Warren said. The vents are open at the base. Air moves up through the gap and carries heat out. At night, the stone radiates, but the air still moves. The boards stay shaded. In theory, Kells said. In theory, Warren agreed. Kells mounted his horse. Finish the east wall, he said. A partial wrap may be worse than nothing. If you shade 3 sides and leave one open, the air circulation changes. You may trap heat instead of venting it. He did not say good luck. He did not say it would fail. He gave Warren a worse gift, a legitimate technical objection that could only be answered by finishing the entire wall before the heat arrived to test it. Warren watched him ride away and felt the math close around him like water. 4 walls, 4 faces. Every stone on every face had to be in place before August, or the partial shield might make things worse. And he was 2 walls behind schedule, losing weight, and coughing blood into his palm in the mornings when Elsie was not watching. Unexpected help came the last week of May, and it came from the direction Warren least expected. Clara Bixby's 2 boys appeared at the claim one morning, pulling a sled loaded with flat limestone. They were 14 and 11, sunburned and lean, and they did not speak to Warren. They unloaded the stone beside his sorted pile, stacked it by size the way they had seen him do, and turned to leave. "Wait," Warren said. "Who sent you?" The older boy, whose name was Martin, looked at his boots. "Ma saw the girl carrying water. She said we could bring stone or she would whip us, but she also said to tell you she still thinks you are building a fool's monument." "She said that?" Her exact words were worse. They came back the next day with another load, and the day after. Clara never came herself. She sent the boys in their sled, and the stones appeared in the sorted pile, and Warren gained 50 extra pieces a day that he did not have to haul from the outcrop. It was not charity in the way that Kells might have offered it, or in the way that Tollef's teaching was offered. It was Clara's way of saying, "I think you are wrong, but I do not want to watch the girl die because you are stubborn." Warren used the extra stone on the east wall. By the first week of June, the base courses on all 4 walls were complete. The west and south stood at full height, 5 feet on the south, nearly 6 on the west, where the afternoon sun hit longest. The north was 4 feet. The east was 3 and rising. Tollef checked the batter on each face and found the south wall leaning slightly outward at the midpoint. He made Warren pull the top 2 courses and rebuild them with better through stones. It cost a day. Warren said nothing. He pulled the courses and rebuilt, and the walls sat tighter, and Tollef nodded once, which was the closest thing to praise the old man had ever offered. The door side was the hardest engineering. Warren could not seal the shack inside a complete stone ring. He needed to get in and out. Tollef showed him how to build returns, short wing walls that angled from the main wall toward the door opening, creating a shaded entry throat. The door itself sat in shadow all day, the returns blocking direct sun from reaching the boards around the frame. Air still moved through the entry, but sunlight did not. Warren's stovepipe was the next casualty. Chet Fallner sent a man with a claim that Warren owed for salvaged boards, not the original debt, which Warren paid interest on, but a separate charge for boards Fallner said had been delivered, but not invoiced. The amount was $2.40. Warren did not have $2.40. He had $1.15 and a spare stovepipe he had been saving for the cooking setup. He sold the stovepipe to the hardware man for $1.25. It covered the false charge. It also left him cooking over an open fire ring outside, which meant smoke in his clothes, ash in the cornmeal, and no way to heat the shack if a cold snap came. June in Kansas could still drop to 40 at night, and Elsie slept under the one blanket and shivered. Chet Fallner had not taken the claim. He had taken something smaller and more precise, the ability to cook indoors. It was the kind of wound that did not show on a ledger, but showed on a child's face when she ate gritty mush and did not complain. The last week of June. Warren stood at the door and looked at the wall. The west face was complete. 5 feet 10 inches of dry stacked limestone, battered inward, through stones every 4 feet, vents at the base, open at the top. The south face matched it. The north stood at 5 feet lower because the north face caught less direct sun, and Warren's body had decided that 5 feet was all it would give him. The east wall was the weak point, 4 feet 2 inches, with one course of capping stones that Tolliff had placed himself because Warren's shoulder had locked up the morning they were due. The door returns were solid. The entry throat was shaded. The gap was clear. Warren raked it every evening with the bent hoe, pulling out grass and dust and the occasional snake that had found the cavity's warmth inviting. From the road, the shack looked like a mistake, a wooden box buried inside a loose ring of pale stone, like something a child might build around a toy to protect it from an imaginary army. The stone faces were uneven. The corners were rough where the returns met the main walls. The batter was visible on the west face, but inconsistent on the south. It was ugly. It was also, by Warren's count, approximately 6,800 stones, each one hauled, sorted, and placed by hand over 12 weeks. Warren began measuring. He had no proper instruments. Clara had lent him a store thermometer, a glass tube with a mercury column, the kind the hardware stores sold for 50 cents SI. And Tolliff had produced a second cheap thermometer from his tool chest, origin unexplained. Warren hung one on the inside of the west plank wall and one on the outside stone face. He drove a stick into the ground in the open sun and hung a rag from it to mark the unshaded control point. The first readings, taken on a clear day in late June with the afternoon temperature at 94, were promising but imperfect. The outer stone face read $97, hotter than air temperature because the stone absorbed direct radiation. The inside of the west plank wall read 86. The open sun control point read 94. The gap between stone and plank, Warren could feel it on his hand when he reached into the cavity, was warm, but the air was moving. It rose against his fingers like breath. 8 degrees of difference on the west wall, meaningful, but not miraculous. Warren wanted more. The evening reading was worse. The outer stone face was still warm at sundown, 89 Decius, and the inside plank wall had climbed to 84. The stone was releasing its stored heat, and some of it was crossing the gap. Dr. Kells had predicted this. The wall was shading the boards during the day, but breathing heat back at them after dark. Warren told Tolliff. Tolliff came that evening and stood in the gap on the south side, his wide shoulders brushing the stone on one side and the boards on the other. He held his scarred hand up, palm open, and felt the air. "The draft is weak," Tolliff said. "The top stones are too tight. Air cannot leave fast enough." He pointed to the south wall's upper course, where Warren had placed capping stones to keep the wall stable. The caps were flat and wide, and they overhung the gap by 2 inches, narrowing the exit. Hot air rising through the cavity was squeezing through a bottleneck and slowing down. The heat that should have vented was pooling. "Remove 3, Tolliff said. "Every 8 feet, leave an opening the width of your fist, not on the windward side, the leeward. Let the draft pull it." Warren climbed the stone pile on the south side and lifted 3 capping stones. The effect was not dramatic. There was no whoosh of air, no visible rush. But when he held his palm over the gap that evening, the upward movement was faster. The air had somewhere to go. Elsie stood inside and pressed her hand to the west wall. "It stopped panning," she said. Warren did not ask her what she meant. He knew. The wall had been breathing heat inward in slow pulses after sundown, and now the pulses were weaker because the heat was leaving through the top instead of lingering in the cavity. The wall was not panting, it was exhaling. But the roof was still bare. Warren looked up at the cedar shakes and felt the heat pressing down from above. The stone wall could shade the four sides, but the roof took full sun all day, and it radiated downward into the single room like a lid on a pan. He lime-washed the roof boards with a thin paste of slaked lime and water, using a bundle of grass as a brush. The white surface reflected more sunlight than the dark cedar. Then he stretched a reed mat, woven from creek rushes by Elsie, who had learned the technique from Clara's boys, on two poles above the south half of the roof, leaving 6 inches of airflow between the mat and the shakes. It helped. The roof was still the weakest point, but the lime wash and the reed mat took the edge off. Warren was honest about this. The wall did not solve everything. The roof needed work. The floor needed work. The whole shack needed to be torn down and rebuilt as a proper stone house. But that was a future project. The present project was keeping Elsie alive through August. News arrived from town in the second week of July. The wells were dropping. The creek draw, where Warren hauled water, had fallen to a trickle. Men at the store talked about rainmakers, itinerant men who claimed they could break a drought with explosives or chemicals or prayer. 2 counties west, a rainmaker had fired a cannon into the sky and charged $100 and produced no rain. The talk had shifted from hope to bitterness, and from bitterness to the blunt vocabulary of survival. How deep is your well? How much water have you stored? How long can your stock last? Tolliff told Warren to fill every vessel he owned. Warren had the cookpot, the lard pail, and 2 wooden buckets with questionable seams. He filled them and set them inside the shack against the east wall, where the shade was deepest. Elsie counted the water every morning the way other children counted pennies. The prairie went yellow, then brown, then the color of old bone. The grass crackled underfoot. Jackrabbits sat motionless under fence shadows, too heat-stunned to run. The wind came from the southwest and tasted like dust and iron, and it did not stop. The crisis began on the 4th of August, 1894. Warren knew it was coming because the air changed. The southwest wind, which had been steady for 2 weeks, intensified the night of the 3rd, and by dawn on the 4th it carried a heat that felt personal, as if the sky had leaned down and pressed its open mouth against the ground. Store thermometers in La Crosse read 102 by noon. By 2 in the afternoon, men who had been outside came into the store and said the reading was past 104 and still climbing. Warren's store thermometer, hung on the outside stone face, read 106 at the hottest point of the first afternoon. The stone was too hot to hold a palm against. Heat shimmered off the outer face in visible waves. The air above the wall danced. Inside the shack, the west plank wall read 89, 17 degrees of difference, on the first day. Warren pressed his palm to the shaded pine and felt warmth, but not the searing iron heat of the stone outside. The gap was working. Air rose through the cavity in a continuous slow draft, carrying heat upward and out through the opened vents. The base vents pulled ground-level air in, not cool, but cooler than the air at the top of the wall, and moving, always moving. Elsie slept through the afternoon for the first time in weeks. She lay on the blanket against the east wall, where the stone shield was lowest, but the shade still held, and she slept with her mouth slightly open and her hands unclenched. Warren sat on the floor beside her and watched her breathe and counted each breath as evidence. The first day was proof, not complete proof. Not the kind of proof that would convince Kells or silence Fallner, but proof enough that Warren's hand stopped shaking when he checked the thermometer, and proof enough that he slept 2 hours that night instead of none. The second day was worse. The wind did not break overnight. It came back at dawn hotter than before, and by mid-morning the store thermometer read 105, and by noon it was past 106 again. The pump handle at the community well was too hot to grip barehanded. Chickens stood in the open with their wings spread, panting. A dog on the lacrosse road lay in a wheel rut and would not move when a wagon approached, and the driver had to climb down and drag it by the scruff. Clara Bixby's youngest boy, Abel, collapsed while carrying water from the draw. He was 11 years old, and he had been hauling 2 buckets in the open sun because Clara's well had gone to mud, and the draw was the closest source. He made it halfway home, and then he stopped walking and sat down in the grass, and did not get up. Clara found him sitting with his eyes open and his skin dry. Dry skin in that heat meant the body had stopped sweating. It meant the cooling mechanism had failed. It meant death was closer than it looked. She sent Martin on the mule to find Dr. Kells. Kells came within the hour. He examined the boy in Clara's sod room, which should have been the coolest available shelter. Sod houses were famous for their insulating properties, and Clara's was cut deep with thick walls. But the sod room had been occupied for weeks in airless heat. The bedding was damp with sweat. The air was foul. The single window faced south and let in light and heat but little breeze. The sod walls were cool to the touch, but the interior air had no circulation, and the room smelled like fever and old straw. Kells looked at the sod room and made a decision that would have been unthinkable 2 months earlier. He turned to Clara and said, "I need to take the boy to Dora's place." Clara stared at him. "The rock fence." "The air moves there," Kells said. "It does not move here." Clara did not argue. She picked up Abel and carried him to the mule and held him against her chest while Martin led the animal north toward Warren's claim. They arrived at the shack in the early afternoon. Warren heard the hoofbeats and came to the door and saw Clara holding her unconscious son and Kells riding behind with his bag. Warren did not ask questions. He cleared the blanket, laid a wet cloth on the floor, and helped Clara set Abel on it against the east wall. The inside of the shack was warm, 89 degrees, the same reading as the day before, not cool, not comfortable, but breathable. The air moved. The west wall, which should have been a radiating furnace at 2 in the afternoon, was shaded behind its stone screen, and the heat that the outer stone face absorbed was rising through the gap and leaving through the top vents. The difference between Clara's still, foul sod room and Warren's moving, shaded air was not a matter of numbers on a thermometer. It was the difference between air that felt like a hand pressed over your face and air that felt like air. Kells worked on the boy. He wet cloths and applied them to Abel's neck and wrists and forehead. He made Clara drip water into the boy's mouth, a spoonful at a time, waiting between each spoon for the swallowing reflex. He checked the boy's pulse every few minutes and said nothing about the readings. Warren stood outside the door, in the shaded entry throat where the stone returns blocked the sun, and watched. He was terrified, not of the heat. He was terrified that the wall would fail while a child lay inside it, that the gap would clog, or the draft would die, or the stones would release their heat inward, and the temperature would climb past the point where Kells could do anything. He checked the base vents every 20 minutes, running his hand along the gap, feeling for the upward draft. It was there, moving, warm but moving. Elsie brought water to Kells without being asked. She had been rationing their supply all week, counting cups the way Warren counted stones. Now she gave the water without counting, and Warren did not stop her because the water was for a boy who could not sweat, and that was more important than arithmetic. Kells measured the interior temperature at 3 in the afternoon and said nothing. His silence was enormous. It filled the shack the way heat fills a room, present in every corner, pressing against every surface. Warren waited for the verdict the way a man waits for a judge. Kells said nothing. Stay with this moment, because the wall had been mocked for months, and now a child's breath depended on whether Warren had understood the heat correctly. The second night, the stones released their stored heat, as Kells had predicted months earlier. The outer face was still warm at sundown, 91 degrees. The interior climbed to 87, but the top vents, widened by Warren's removal of capping stones, kept the draft moving, and the temperature peaked at 87 and held. It did not climb to 90. It did not climb to the temperature of the open air. The gap breathed, and the heat left, and the shack sat at 87 degrees at midnight while the air outside was still 90. Abel's fever broke at 2 in the morning. He opened his eyes and asked for water and did not know where he was. The third day. Everything went wrong at once. The wind shifted from southwest to due west and intensified. Dust filled the air so thick that Warren could not see the road from the door. The gusts drove grit and dry grass against the stone wall and packed the base vents with debris. Warren noticed at mid-morning when the interior temperature climbed past 90 and kept climbing. He went outside. The heat hit him like a wall of cloth soaked in hot water. The stone face was too hot to touch. He could feel the radiation from 3 feet away, a pressure against his skin that was not wind but heat moving through air. The store thermometer had burst its column. The mercury sat at the top of the tube, past the highest mark. He crouched beside the west wall and looked at the base vents. Packed solid. Dry grass, tumbleweeds, dust, a dead bird, a sparrow that had crawled into the gap seeking shade and died there. The cavity was clogged. The draft had stopped. Air was no longer moving through the gap, and the stone's stored heat was pressing inward against the pine boards with nothing to carry it away. Warren grabbed the bent hoe handle. He crawled along the base of the west wall, pulling debris from each vent, reaching into the gap with his bare hand to clear the blockage. The stones burned his wrists. Not figuratively. The surface temperature of the outer face was high enough to raise red marks on his skin within seconds. He wrapped his hands in the flour sack strips, already dark with old blood, and kept clearing. Elsie tried to follow him out. Tolliff, who had come at dawn and stayed when the wind turned, stopped her at the door. "Stay inside," he said. It was the first time Warren had heard Tolliff give Elsie a direct command, and the old man's voice was steady in a way that meant he was frightened. Warren cleared the west vents. 12 openings, each one clogged. He moved to the south wall. The south was worse. The wind drove debris directly into the base gaps, and 3 of the clean-out stones had shifted, narrowing the openings to nothing. He pulled the clean-out stones out, cleared the packed grass, replaced them, and moved to the east wall. His wrists were striped with burns. His cough was a continuous thing now, not separate episodes, but a low grinding in his chest that did not stop between breaths. Inside, Kells had Abel sitting up and drinking water. Clara was pressing wet cloths to her own face, which was flushed and tight. Martin stood against the north wall with his eyes wide, watching the door for his mother's signal. Elsie held the water bucket and did not let go of it, as if keeping her hands on the water could keep the water from running out. By noon, the vents were clear. The draft resumed. The interior temperature dropped from 92 to 88 in 40 minutes. Warren came inside with burnt wrist and dust in his lungs, and sat on the floor and coughed until Elsie brought him water. Kells looked at Warren's wrists. He did not treat them. He looked at the cleared vents. He looked at the thermometer. And he said quietly, to no one in particular, 88. Outside on the open prairie, it was 108. The afternoon of the third day brought the final complication. Chet Fallner's hired boy, a teenager named Reese, 16, who stacked lumber in Fallner's yard for meals and a corner to sleep in, collapsed inside the lumber shed at 2 in the afternoon. The shed was a frame building with a tar paper roof, stacked floor to ceiling with boards that had been baking in the sun for weeks. The interior temperature was not measured because Fallner did not own a thermometer, but Reese walked into the shed to pull an order and did not walk out. Fallner found him on the dirt floor between 2 stacks of pine, his face the color of tallow, and his breath coming in shallow gasps that sounded like paper tearing. Fallner was many things, but he was not a man who let a boy die on his property. He sent for Kells. Kells was at Warren's shack. The message arrived by a man on horseback who had been told to find the doctor wherever he was. Kells looked at the message and looked at Warren and said, "Fallner's boy is down. I need to bring him here." Warren did not hesitate. "Bring him." Chet Fallner arrived an hour later, carrying Reese across the back of a wagon. He pulled up to Warren's claim and looked at the stone wall and the shaded entry throat and the wet cloths hanging in the windows and the 2 thermometers wired to the wall. He looked at Abel Bixby sitting up and drinking water inside. He looked at the interior of the shack, which held 8 degrees below the temperature of the air and 20 degrees below the temperature of his own lumber shed. Fallner carried Reese inside and set him on the floor. He did not speak to Warren. He did not look at the wall. He stood in the doorway of the shack he had sold Warren at a predatory price, the shack he had tried to repossess, the shack wrapped in the stones he had mocked, and he watched Kells work on a boy who had collapsed inside Fallner's own building because Fallner had not thought about heat the way Warren had. Kells treated Reese the same way he had treated Abel: wet cloth, slow water, pulse checks, patience. The shack now held 6 people in a room 12 by 16 feet. Warren, Elsie, Kells, Clara, Abel, and Reese, with Martin outside holding the horses and Tollef sitting on an overturned bucket by the door, watching the vents. It was crowded. It was warm. It was not lethal. And that was the difference. Outside, the heat pressed against the stone wall like a living thing. Warren could hear the stones ticking, the sound of thermal expansion, tiny shifts in the dry stacked faces as the outer surface grew hotter than the inner. The wall was taking punishment, absorbing radiation that would have poured through the pine boards and turned the room into the inside of a stove. The stone was the sacrifice. The gap was the escape. The board sat behind them both, shaded and warm, but not killing. Late in the afternoon, Tollef went to check the upper vents on the south wall. He climbed the stone pile Warren used as a step and reached for the top course to steady himself. The stone he gripped had been in direct sun for 8 hours. It was hot enough to cook on. Tollef pulled his hand back, lost his balance, and fell sideways. His hip hit the top of the wall. His hand went into the gap between the stone and the shack boards. Warren heard the old man cry out, a short, hard sound, not dramatic, the sound of a body receiving an injury it did not expect, and he was outside before the cry finished. Tollef was wedged between the wall and the shack, his left hand trapped in the gap, his right gripping the top course. His hand was torn. The rough stone had opened the skin from palm to wrist, and his body was pressed against the hot outer face of the south wall. Warren grabbed Tollef's shoulders and pulled. The old man came free with a grunt and sat heavily in the dust. Warren's own shoulder, already damaged from weeks of lifting, screamed as he took Tollef's weight. Something in the joint shifted wrong and stayed wrong. Warren knelt in the dirt beside Tolef and held his arm against his chest and waited for the pain to find its level. Tolef's hand was bleeding freely. The cut was deep, running along the base of the thumb where the stone edge had caught the skin. Warren wrapped it with a strip of cloth, and Tolef held the hand against his shirt and looked at the wall and said, in a voice that was quiet and clear and absolutely serious, "Do not close the top. Let it breathe." It was not about the vents. It was about everything. The wall breathed because the top was open. The gap worked because the air moved. The stones took the heat because the air carried it away. Close the top, and the system died. The wall became what Kells had feared, a heat battery, storing the sun's energy and releasing it into the living space all night. Warren helped Tolef to the door. Kells bandaged the hand properly and said the cut needed stitches but would have to wait for clean instruments. Tolef sat against the north wall and held his wrapped hand in his lap and closed his eyes. Night came, the third night. Reese woke at 9 in the evening, confused and frightened, and Clara gave him water while Kells checked his pulse. Abel was strong enough to stand and walk to the door and look at the stars through the shaded entry throat. The temperature inside the shack at midnight was 85. Outside, the air was still 91. Dr. Kells sat on the floor with his back against the east wall. He had been working for 2 days without sleep. His bag was open beside him, the instruments laid out on a cloth, the water supply nearly gone. He looked at the thermometer on the west wall, the one Warren had hung weeks earlier. He looked at the stone face visible through the base vent. He looked at the room full of people who were alive because a man had stacked 6,800 stones in a ring around a shack that everyone had called a coffin. "It should have baked them," Kells said. His voice was flat with exhaustion. "It did not." He did not say the wall worked. He did not say Warren was right. He said the one thing a scientist says when the evidence contradicts his prediction. The expected outcome did not occur. It was the most honest form of conversion, and Warren heard it and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. Fallner had left hours earlier. He had carried Reese in and watched Kells treat him, and stood in the doorway of Warren's shack, while the heat outside pressed against the stone, and the air inside moved, and the boy who had collapsed in Fallner's lumber shed breathed steady in a room wrapped in the rocks Fallner had kicked off a handcart in his yard. He left without speaking. He did not thank Warren. He did not look at the wall. He climbed into his wagon and drove south, and the dust from his wheels hung in the hot air and did not settle. Warren sat on the step of the shaded entry throat at dawn on the 5th of August and watched the sun come up over a prairie the color of ash. The stone wall stood around him, ugly and warm, and covered in dust and alive with the slow convection of heated air rising through the gap. Elsie slept inside. Abel slept inside. Tolef's hand was wrapped in white cloth that had turned pink at the edges. The water was nearly gone. The wall had held, not perfectly, not magically, not the way a story tells it, where the invention works without flaw and the hero stands triumphant. The wall had clogged, and Warren had crawled in the killing heat to clear it. The wall had injured Tolef, and the old man's hand would never fully close again. The wall had held 8 degrees of difference at its best, and 6 degrees at its worst, and in a crisis where the air outside reached 108, those degrees were the distance between a child breathing and a child not breathing. That was all, and that was everything. 3 continues. The morning after the crisis broke, people came to look at the wall. They did not come in a group. They came one at a time, the way people approach a thing they mocked and now must reckon with. A man from the creek settlement rode up at dawn and sat on his horse and looked at the stone ring for 5 minutes without dismounting, Clara's neighbor, a woman named Hester Lund, walked over from the south road with her hand shading her eyes and stood at the corner of the west wall and touched the stone. It was still warm. The outer face held the residue of 3 days at 106, stored deep in the limestone's grain, releasing slowly into the morning air. But the pine boards behind the gap, she reached through a base vent and pressed her fingers to the wood, were not warm. They were the temperature of a shaded thing, a thing that had been protected. Warren did not give tours. He did not explain. He stood at the door and let people look. Tollef sat on the overturned bucket with his bandaged hand in his lap and watched each visitor the way a man watches someone discover a thing he has always known. Elsie handed out cups of water. They were nearly dry. The crisis had burned through their stored supply. But she gave what there was because the people who came to look at the wall were also people who had spent 3 days in buildings that did not protect them, and their faces showed it. Chapped lips, red skin along the jaw and neck, eyes narrowed from squinting against glare. The heat had left marks on everyone, and the marks were the same marks whether you had mocked the wall or not. Dr. Kells returned at mid-morning. He had gone home to sleep and returned with clean bandages for Tollef's hand and a second thermometer, his own, a better instrument than the store model with finer gradations. He hung it inside the shack beside Warren's and took readings at 10, at noon, at 2. The heat had not fully broken. The 4th of August had been the worst day, but the 5th was still brutal, 98 by noon, 101 by 2. Kells recorded the interior at 84 at the hottest point. The outer stone face read 103. The gap was working as designed. Stone taking radiation, air carrying heat upward, board sitting in shade. Kells wrote the numbers in a small notebook. Then he closed the notebook and looked at Warren. "I was wrong about the wall," Kells said. Warren waited for the rest. "I was not wrong about the danger," Kells continued. "If you had built this with the top sealed or the vents closed or the gap packed with straw, it would have killed that girl. The margin between what you built and what would have killed her is 6 inches of air and an open top. Do you understand that?" "Yes," Warren said. "Good." Kells paused. He looked at the west wall, where the stone face shimmered with stored heat. "The schoolhouse west wall takes sun from noon to 4. The children sit against it. By September, the late heat will be worse than August because the angle drops and the wall takes more direct radiation. I need you to help me shade it before school opens." It was not praise. It was a commission. Kells did not say, "Your wall is brilliant," or "I should have trusted you." He said, "I need your help," which was harder to say and meant more, because it required Dr. Orrin Kells to admit that a frail widower with a cracked shovel and a limeyard memory knew something about heat that a former army surgeon did not. Warren said, "I will need Tollef." Kells looked at Tollef's bandaged hand. "Can he work?" Tollef answered from the bucket, "I can tell someone else where to put a stone." Clara Bixby came the following day. She brought Martin and Abel walking on his own now, thin but upright, and she brought 24 eggs packed in grass and a jar of pickled beets. She did not bring them as a gift. She brought them as payment. "I owe you for the boy," she said. She set the eggs on the step and the beets beside them and looked at the wall. Warren said, "You sent your boys with stone for 2 months. You don't owe me anything." "That was before the wall worked. Now it is different." She walked the perimeter the way Kells had walked it months earlier, but her hands moved differently. Where Kells had pressed and measured, Clara touched and calculated. She was a practical woman on a hard claim with 2 boys and no husband, and she looked at the wall the way she looked at any tool. Could it be made? Could it be maintained? Could it save labor in the long run? She stopped at the east wall, the lowest section, and looked at the gap. How wide? She asked. 6 inches, Tolliff measured with a spacer stick. And the bottom slots? Open, every 4 feet, angled stones to keep animals out. The top? Open. You cannot seal it. The air must leave. Clara nodded. She looked at her own claim, a mile and a half east, where her sod house sat in the open sun. The sod kept cool better than planks, but the west wall still soaked heat in the afternoon, and the interior grew foul by August because sod breathed moisture but not air. She had spent 3 summers in that house, and each August was the same: headaches, spoiled food, the boys sleeping outside because the inside air felt like breathing through a wet cloth. I do not need the whole house wrapped, she said, just the west wall, and maybe a screen over the milk shelf. I can show your boys how to stack it, Warren said. Martin is strong enough. The stone is the same on your claim as mine. Clara looked at him. You would teach them? Tolliff taught me. I did not pay him either. Clara left with the knowledge that the wall could be partial, a single face on the worst exposure, built in a week instead of 12, using the same principles of gap and vent and batter. She did not thank Warren. She said, I will send Martin on Monday. Word spread the way practical knowledge spreads in a county where people talk at the store and the post office and the wellhead, not as a story, but as a solution. A man named Harkin, who farmed east of the creek, rode to Warren's claim and asked whether a low stone wall beside a water trough would keep the water from heating in the afternoon sun. Warren said it depended on the height and the angle and the distance from the trough, and he drew it on a flour sack, and Harkin took the flour sack home and started stacking. A woman named Renner, Lydia Renner, the school teacher, came with Dr. Kells to look at the schoolhouse wall. She brought a slate and a pencil and asked Warren to explain how the heat moved. Warren looked at Tolliff. Tolliff shook his head. You explain it. I stack it. Warren explained it the way his father had explained it to him 30 years earlier in a lime yard in Missouri. Not with physics. Not with words like convection or radiation. With his hands. He held one palm against the stone face. This is hot. He held the other palm against the pine board behind the gap. This is not. He put both hands in the gap and held them there while the air rose between his fingers. This is why. Lydia Renner wrote on the slate. Sun hits stone. Stone heats air. Air rises. Wood stays shaded. That is the whole method? She asked. That is the whole method, Warren said. The rest is stacking. She looked at him with the expression of a teacher who has found a lesson worth teaching, and Warren looked away because he was not accustomed to being looked at that way. He was accustomed to being looked at the way Fallner looked at him, or the way the men on the road looked at him, or the way Kells had looked at him that first day, as a man who had done the wrong thing and would pay for it. Tolliff Asen stayed on Warren's claim for 2 more weeks after the crisis. His hand was healing badly. Kells had stitched it, but the cut ran deep along the base of the thumb, and the tendons beneath had been damaged by the rough stone edge. Tolliff could grip a hammer but not close his fist. He could point at a stone and tell Warren where to place it, but he could not pick it up and set it himself. They spent those 2 weeks refining the wall, not building new sections. The shack was fully wrapped, but improving what existed. Tolliff showed Warren how to reset the through-stones on the south wall where thermal cycling had shifted them. He showed him how to wedge small pinning stones above each through-stone to lock it against movement. He showed him how to read the wall's face for signs of pressure. A stone tilting outward meant the harding behind it had settled and needed packing. A gap opening at a joint meant frost or heat had moved the courses and the section needed rebuilding. A stone wall is not finished, Tolliff said one afternoon. sitting on his bucket while Warren repacked a section of hearting on the north face. A stone wall is maintained. You build it once and tend it every year, or it becomes a pile. Warren nodded. He had already learned this. The gap needed raking. The vents needed clearing. The clean-out stones needed checking. The wall was alive in the way that any structure exposed to weather is alive. It shifted, it settled, it responded to heat and cold and wind and rain. It required attention. Tolliff used the repair days to teach Warren things that had nothing to do with the shade wall. He taught him how pioneers in post-rock country split limestone with hand tools, drill a line of holes along the grain, set wedges in each hole, tap evenly down the line with a hammer, listen for the crack that meant the stone was ready to break. The crack was not loud. It was a sound like a knuckle popping, deep inside the rock, and if you hit too hard after the crack, the stone shattered instead of splitting clean. Warren split his first stone on a Tuesday. Tolliff placed the drill and held it while Warren swung the hammer. The drill bit into the limestone and left a round hole the diameter of a finger. They drilled 8 holes along a 4-foot slab, set iron wedges, and Warren tapped down the line, left to right, even pressure. Light strikes. Listen. The crack came on the 3rd pass. The stone opened along the drill line like a book, and the 2 halves fell apart, each one flat-faced and true. Warren held the half slab and felt its weight and its smoothness, and he understood why Tolliff had spent 30 years doing this. The stone cooperated if you listened. It broke where you asked it to break if you asked correctly. "Now you hear the rock before I do," Tolliff said. It was the most Warren had ever heard the old man say in a single sentence that was not about construction. The evening conversations grew longer as Tolliff's departure approached. Warren learned that Tolliff had come to Kansas in 1868, 26 years old, with a wife who died of typhoid in 1871 and a daughter who married a store clerk in Hayes. He had quarried stone for 30 years and built walls for 20 of those years and never once been asked to build a shade screen because nobody had thought to ask. The idea was not Tolliff's. The execution was, and Tolliff respected the distinction. "You saw the gap," Tolliff said one evening, watching the sun set through the stone wall's upper vents. "I would not have seen the gap. I see beds and faces and batter. You see air." It was as close to sentiment as Tolliff came. Warren sat beside him and said nothing because the old man did not need a response. He needed a witness, and Warren was that. Tolliff left on a Thursday in late August. His daughter had sent word that she could take him in. His hand would not close around a hammer, and his limp had worsened over the summer, and the work of walking to Warren's claim each morning had become the kind of effort that aged a man visibly between sunrise and noon. He gave Warren his stone hammer. It was a short-handled tool, heavy in the head, the steel face worn smooth from 30 years of splitting. The handle was ash, darkened with palm oil and sweat, fitted to the grip of a hand wider than Warren's. "I do not need 2 hands to eat my daughter's cooking," Tolliff said. "I need 2 hands to swing this. You have 2 hands." Warren took the hammer and held it and felt its balance, which was different from any tool he had used, forward heavy, designed to let the steel do the work while the hand guided. Tolliff's hand had shaped the handle's curve over decades. Warren's hand would learn it. Tolliff walked to the road. He did not look back. Warren stood at the wall and watched the old man's limp carry him south toward the La Crosse Road, and he held the hammer against his chest the way a man holds a thing that means more than its weight, and he did not call out, because Tolliff was not a man who needed goodbyes. He needed the knowledge that the wall would stand, and the wall was standing. The claim was quiet that evening. Elsie cooked cornmeal over the fire ring, and did not ask where Tolliff had gone, because she had seen the hammer in Warren's hand and understood. Warren sat on the step of the shaded entry throat and listened to the air move through the gap. It made a sound in the evening, when the stone released its heat and the draft pulled strongest, a low, steady whisper, like breath drawn through teeth. Tolliff had heard that sound every day for months and never mentioned it, because to Tolliff it was the sound of a wall working, and a working wall did not need to be remarked upon. Warren heard it now the way Tolliff had heard it, not as a curiosity, not as proof, as the sound of a thing doing what it was built to do, quietly, without praise, without stopping. September brought the secondary crisis, and it came from the direction Warren had been asked to face. The schoolhouse sat on the south edge of La Crosse, a single-room frame building with pine walls and a shingled roof, oriented east-west. The west wall took full afternoon sun from noon to 4, and the interior temperature during September, when the sun angle dropped and drove more direct radiation into the vertical surface, was worse than August in some ways, because the lower angle meant the wall absorbed heat for a longer continuous period. 3 children showed signs of heat exhaustion during afternoon lessons in the first week of September. Lydia Renner dismissed classes early and sent for Kells. Kells examined the children, prescribed water and shade, and went to find Warren. "The west wall," Kells said. "Can you shield it before Monday?" It was Thursday. Warren had 4 days. Chet Fallner had already made his offer. He would sell lumber awnings on credit to the school board, pine frames with cedar shake roofs, extending 4 feet from the west wall, providing shade from above. The cost was $14, financed at Fallner's standard terms, secured against the school board's operating funds. The board, which had no money and less patience, was inclined to accept because the alternative was closing school until October. Warren proposed a different solution, a partial stone screen on the west wall only, 5 feet high, 2 feet thick, 6-inch gap, open top, base vents, built by community labor in 2 days. Materials: limestone from the nearest outcrop, free. Cost: sweat. The school board: 3 men who farmed when they were not arguing about the school budget, looked at Warren and looked at Fallner and asked the question that mattered. "Does it work?" Kells answered, "I have seen it work." The door shack held 8 degrees below ambient during the worst 3 days this summer. The wall is ugly, and it requires maintenance. It also kept a boy alive that my instrument said should have died. The board chose the wall. Warren had 4 days, no Tolliff, a bad shoulder, and a community that had mocked his building method for 5 months. He stood at the schoolhouse on Thursday afternoon and looked at the west wall, 24 feet long, 10 feet to the eave, and felt the weight of what he had promised. The first volunteers arrived Friday morning. Clara's boys, Martin and Abel. Martin was 14 and strong enough to haul the sled. Abel was 11 and still thin from the crisis, but he sorted stones with the careful hands of a boy who had lain on a floor behind a stone wall and breathed when the air outside wanted to kill him. Abel did not need to be told why the wall mattered. His body had told him. Hester Lunn came with her husband and a mule. The man from the creek settlement, his name was Goss, came with a wagon and 2 sons. Lydia Renner came with the school slate, on which she had drawn Warren's diagram of sun, stone, gap, and air, and she hung it on the schoolhouse wall so every volunteer could see what they were building and why. Warren directed the work the way Tolliff had directed him, not by lecturing, but by placing stones. He laid the first course himself, setting the base stones on the dug trench, checking the spacer stick against the schoolhouse boards, ensuring the 6-inch gap was consistent. Then he stood back and told Martin to lay the second course. Martin placed a stone wrong, rounded face down, no clear bed. Warren picked it up, turned it, and set it back in Martin's hands with the bed facing down. Martin placed it correctly. Warren nodded. Tulliff's nod. The old man's language passed forward. The wall went up in 2 days. It was not beautiful. It was 5 feet of rough limestone on a 24-foot run, with base vents every 4 feet and an open top and through stones that Warren placed himself because through stones were the structural bones, and he did not trust anyone else with them yet. The batter was slight but present. The gap was 6 inches measured by a spacer stick that Martin had cut himself after watching Warren cut the first one. On Monday, Lydia Renner held afternoon lessons with the west wall shielded. The interior temperature at 3 in the afternoon was 7 degrees below what it had been the previous week. The children sat against the west wall and did not complain of headaches. Lydia recorded the temperature on her slate and showed it to Kells, who recorded it in his notebook, who showed it to the school board, who said nothing because the evidence was on the wall and the wall was on the building, and the building was cooler. Chet Fallner watched the schoolhouse build from his lumberyard across the road. He did not interfere. He did not offer help. He watched a community of people who owed him money and feared his credit terms build a free wall out of free stone based on a free method designed by a man Fallner had tried to ruin, and he understood, not with his conscience, which was flexible, but with his ledger sense, which was precise, that the wall was a threat. If this story reminds you why preparation matters before the crisis arrives, share it with someone who would understand Warren's wall only after feeling that heat, not a threat to his safety, a threat to his business. If settlers could shade their buildings with free stone and a 6-inch gap, they did not need Fallner's lumber awnings. They did not need his porch frames. They did not need his credit terms, which were the real product Fallner sold, not wood, but debt, and the leveraged debt provided. Fallner's response was commercial. Within a week, he had posted a sign outside his yard. Door stone shade kits, premium boards, and stone delivered, patent method. He claimed Warren's design as a product, charged $3 for a set of spacer boards and sorting instructions, and told buyers the method required his specific materials to work properly. Warren heard about the sign from Clara. He walked to town and stood in front of Fallner's yard and read it. He did not tear it down. He did not confront Fallner. He walked to the store and drew the method on a flour sack, the same flour sack diagram he had drawn for himself in April, and pinned it to the store's notice board with a note, free, 6-inch gap, open top, batter inward, ask door. Fallner pulled the flour sack down that evening. Warren pinned another one up the next morning. Fallner pulled it down. Warren pinned up a third. On the 4th morning, the store owner, a man named Webb who had no stake in the fight, told Fallner to leave the notice board alone or take his business elsewhere. The flour sack stayed. The bad copy came in the 3rd week of September, and it nearly destroyed everything Warren had built. 2 men from the South Settlement, names Warren did not know and the story does not need, had seen Fallner's sign and bought the kit. But they had not read the flour sack diagram, and Fallner's kit did not mention the gap. The spacer boards Fallner sold were 2 inches wide, not 6, and the instructions said nothing about open tops or base vents. The men stacked stone directly against their shack's west wall. No gap, no vents. The stone touched the pine boards. The wall was 5 feet high, 2 feet thick, and sealed tight at the top with capping stones that left no room for air to escape. The result was exactly what Dr. Kells had predicted in May. The stone absorbed heat all day and released it directly into the pine boards all night. The boards, pressed against the stone with no air gap to buffer them, soaked up conducted heat like a sponge. The interior temperature of the shack rose 8 degrees above what it had been without the wall. The stone was not shading the building, it was insulating it, trapping heat against the wood instead of venting it away. One of the men's wives developed heat sickness. Kells treated her and asked how the wall had been built. When he heard the answer, no gap, no vents, Fallner's kit, he rode to Warren's claim and told him. Warren's stomach dropped. The wall he had spent 5 months building, the wall that had saved Abel Bixby and Fallner's hired boy, the wall the schoolhouse now depended on, was being blamed for a failure caused by a bad copy sold by the man who had mocked it. Fallner was already telling people. He stood at the store and said, Door's rock method made the Hensley place worse. Stone holds heat. I told everyone that from the start. Warren went to the south settlement. He looked at the wall. He put his hand on the stone and felt the boards behind it, and there were no boards behind it. There was stone, and then more stone, and then wood, with no air between them. The wall was a brick pressed against a plank. He did not explain this to the two men. He showed them. He pulled the top course of stones off the west section, reached into the gap, there was no gap, and pressed his palm to the boards. The wood was hotter than the stone face. Heat was conducting straight through. This is not the method, Warren said. The method is the space. He spent 2 days dismantling the south settlement wall and rebuilding it with a 6-inch gap, base vents, open top, and batter. The two men helped because they had seen their wall make things worse and they wanted it made right. Warren used Tollef's teaching, bed, face, harding, through stones, spacer stick. He built it the way Tollef had built it, 1 stone at a time, checking each course with his hand in the gap, feeling for the draft that meant air was moving. When it was finished, he stood in front of the rebuilt wall with the two men and the small crowd that had gathered. Because crowds gathered when Warren built walls now, the way crowds had gathered to laugh 4 months earlier, and he said the thing that needed to be said. The stone is not the trick. The space is. If you close the space, you build an oven. If you seal the top, the heat stays. If you let the wall touch the wood, the heat goes straight through. The space is what saves it. He said it simply, without anger, without looking at Fallner's yard. But everyone who heard it understood who had sold the bad kit and who had built the wall without the gap, and who was standing in front of a rebuilt wall explaining the principle for free while someone else charged $3 for instructions that did not work. Fallner took his sign down the next day. He did not apologize. He did not admit fault. He took the sign down and sold lumber and kept his mouth closed about the rock method, which was the closest thing to retreat Chet Fallner was capable of. Lydia Renner began appearing at the claim in the evenings. She came first because of the schoolhouse project. She needed to coordinate the next phase, which was a shade screen on the south wall of the teachers' quarters, a small lean-to behind the school where she slept during the term. But the coordination required 1 visit, and Lydia came back 4 times that week. She brought her slate. She asked Warren to explain the heat movement again, not for herself, but for the lessons she was planning. She wanted the children to understand why the wall worked, not just that it worked. She asked about the limeyard memory, and Warren told her about his father's thumb in the gap, and she wrote on the slate, "Heat needs a road. Break the road." Your father said that? He was a kiln laborer. He did not know why it worked. He knew it worked. That is often enough, Lydia said. She was 28. She had come to Kansas from Iowa to teach because Kansas needed teachers, and Iowa had more of them than it could employ. She was small and direct, and she sharpened her pencils with a knife she kept in her apron pocket. And she looked at Warren when he spoke about stone and air the way she looked at a problem she intended to solve, with patience and attention and no tolerance for imprecision. Warren was not accustomed to being looked at this way. He was accustomed to the look Fallner gave him, which was the look of a man calculating a price. He was accustomed to the look Clara gave him, which was the look of a woman deciding whether he was a fool or merely unlucky. He was accustomed to the look Kells gave him, which was the look of a doctor assessing a patient's odds. Lydia looked at him as if he had said something worth hearing, and she wanted him to say more. She helped him turn the rough flour sack diagrams into proper drawings on paper she brought from the school supply. She drew cross-sections of the wall: outer face, hearting, inner face, air gap, wooden wall. She labeled the arrows: sun, heat into stone. Hot air rises, cool air enters below. She drew the through stones and the base vents and the open top and the spacer stick. Warren watched her draw and corrected the proportions. "The gap is wider than that," he said once, pointing at her cross-section. "If you draw it too narrow, someone will build it too narrow." She erased and redrew. She did not bristle at the correction. She nodded and adjusted, and Warren recognized in that nod the same thing he had recognized in Tollef's teaching: a person who cared about getting it right more than getting credit. The drawings went up in the schoolhouse beside the temperature slate. Children tested the method in miniature: 2 boards, one shaded behind a stack of stones with a gap, one in the open sun. By afternoon, the shaded board was warm. The exposed board was too hot to hold. The children touched both and understood what Warren had understood in April, kneeling beside his shack with his palm on shaded pine. The difference was that these children would remember. Not as a survival technique, but as a principle. Surfaces that face the sun store heat. Air that moves carries heat away. A gap between a hot surface and a living space is not empty. It is working. October brought the first cool nights, and with them a pause in the heat crisis that had driven everything since April. Warren's walls still stood. The stone faces had weathered through the summer. Dust had filled small cracks. Rain had washed the outer surface pale. Frost would come soon and test the mortar-free joints in a different way. But the wall stood, and the shack behind it had survived its first summer as something other than a coffin. Warren used the cooler weeks to make the repairs Tollef had taught him. He repacked the hearting on the south wall where thermal cycling had opened gaps. He reset through stones that had shifted. He cleaned the cavity one final time and placed the clean-out stones back and checked every vent. He worked with Tollef's hammer. It swung differently than any tool he had owned, heavier in the head, demanding a wrist motion that was more guidance than force. The steel face rang against the limestone with a sound that was sharper than his old tools produced, and Warren began to hear what Tollef had meant about hearing the rock. A solid stone rang clear, a cracked stone rang dull. A stone with a hidden flaw, a frost split running through its center, rang with a faint buzz, like a fly against glass. He hung the hammer on a peg beside the door when he was not using it. Tollef had carried it on his belt. Warren was not Tollef. He was a man who had learned from Tollef, which was a different thing, and the hammer on the peg was a reminder of the difference and of the debt. 12 families in the county adopted some version of the wall by the end of October. 4 built full wraps, west, south, east, north, because their shacks were as exposed as Warren's and they had the labor and the stone. The rest built partial screens, west wall only, or west and south, or a low shield beside a water trough, or a ventilated screen around a milk shelf to keep dairy cool through the afternoon. Not every version worked. 2 families built the gap too narrow, 4 inches instead of 6, and the convection was sluggish. 1 family closed the top vents because they were afraid of rain entering the cavity, and the wall trapped heat at night until Warren came and opened it. 1 man stacked rounded creek stones without sorting, and the wall collapsed in a windstorm. Each failure was a lesson. Warren visited every failed wall and diagnosed the problem the way Tollef had diagnosed his first collapse, by pointing at the stone that had no bed, or the gap that had no air, or the vent that had no opening. He did not charge for these visits. He did not keep a ledger. He kept a reputation which was worth more than money in a county where the next summer was always coming, and the buildings had not changed. Lydia Renner kept the temperature slate. She recorded readings from Warren's shack, from the schoolhouse, from Clara's partial screen, from the Harkin water trough shade. She plotted them on a school tablet, temperature against time of day, shaded wall against unshaded wall, wrapped building against unwrapped building. The data was crude. The instruments were cheap. The readings were taken by a school teacher and a quarryman student with flour sack diagrams and store thermometers. But the pattern was visible. Every shaded wall read lower than its unshaded neighbor. Every gap with airflow read lower than a gap without. Every open top performed better than a closed one. The numbers varied. 6 degrees here, 10 degrees there, 4 degrees on a calm day when the wind did not push the convection, but the direction was always the same. The wall worked, not by magic, by physics that a 12-year-old in a limeyard had felt on his fingertip and a 42-year-old on a Kansas claim had remembered. 4 continues. Warren Door's yard became a place people visited before they built. Not a store, not a business. A yard beside a shack wrapped in stone where a thin man with a bad cough and scarred hands sat on a step and answered questions. The questions were always the same shape, even when the details differed. How wide is the gap? How high does the wall need to be? What if my stone is round? What if I only have one face to shield? What about the roof? Warren answered each one the way Tolliff had answered him, by picking up a stone and showing them. He kept a sorted pile beside the door, flatbeds, irregular hearting, round rejects. He kept the spacer stick leaning against the west wall. He kept the shade gauge, Tolliff's scrapboard invention, mounted on a post behind the south face, still casting its stripe of shadow at noon. People brought their own stone. That was the rule Warren established without calling it a rule. He did not deliver materials. He did not haul rock to someone else's claim. If you wanted to learn, you brought a sled of limestone to his yard, and he showed you how to sort it, and you practiced stacking a small section under his eye, and then you went home and built it yourself. The labor was yours. The knowledge was free. Martin Bixby became the first real apprentice. Clara sent him 3 days a week through October and November, and Martin stacked stone with a patience that surprised Warren, who had expected a 14-year-old boy to rush. Martin did not rush. He placed each stone the way Warren had taught him Tolliff had taught Warren, bed down, face out, check the batter, check the gap. He built a practice wall behind Warren's shack 3 feet high and 8 feet long, and took it apart and rebuilt it 4 times until Warren said, "That one can stay." Elsie painted white marks on the good-face stones. She used lime wash and a stick, dabbing a small circle on each stone that had a clear bed and a usable face. It was a sorting system a child could maintain, and it saved Warren from handling every stone twice. She also kept the temperature slate, the school slate Clara had lent them, recording morning and afternoon readings in a hand that was growing steadier as her 10th birthday approached. She no longer fainted. She no longer sat against the east wall with her lips cracked and her wrists thin as sticks. She carried water and sorted stone and slept through August nights in a shack that held the heat at arm's length. And she grew the way children grow when the thing that was killing them stops. Quietly, visibly, without remark. Warren noticed. He did not say anything about it. He hung Tolliff's hammer on the peg and went to the outcrop and loaded the cart and brought stone back and sorted it and stacked it, and the rhythm of the work was the rhythm of a life that had found its shape, not comfortable, not easy. The cough remained. The shoulder ached in cold weather. The debt to Fallner still sat on the books, accruing interest that Warren paid in small amounts when he could and ignored when he could not. But the shape was there: stone, gap, air, shade, a principle applied to the world, one wall at a time. The winter of 1894 to 1895 was mild by Kansas standards, but it tested the wall in a way summer had not. The question was not whether stone could block heat, but whether the gap and vents would create a cold draft that made the shack worse in January. Warren found the answer in Tolliffe's teaching. He set flat stones over the base vents, not sealed, but angled to block direct wind entry while leaving a narrow slot for air movement. He packed loose straw around the outside base of the stone wall, where it could insulate the lower courses without entering the cavity. The gap still breathed, but slowly, and the stone mass that had absorbed summer heat now absorbed winter sun on clear days and released a faint warmth into the cavity at night. The shack was not warm. Warren bought a second-hand stove from a man leaving the county, paid for it with 3 days of stonework on the man's root cellar, and the stovepipe went back through the north wall, and the fire kept the room above freezing. But the stone wall cut the wind. The pine boards, sheltered from direct exposure, did not frost on the inside the way unshielded plank walls did in neighboring shacks. Clara told Warren her boys had scraped ice off the interior of her sod house's window frame every morning in January. Warren's window frame was dry. It was a small victory. It was also data. Lydia Renner recorded it on the slate. Winter note: no interior frost on shielded walls. Frost on east wall above. Stone line where boards are exposed. The wall worked in both directions. Not equally, its summer performance was far more dramatic than its winter contribution, but the principle held. A buffer of stone and air between the living space and the weather reduced extremes in both seasons. Warren had not designed it for winter. The winter benefit was a gift from physics, delivered without invoice. Spring of 1895 brought Chet Fallner's final reckoning, and it came not from Warren but from the prairie itself. Late March. The grass was still brown from the previous summer's drought, dry and brittle, pressed flat by winter wind. A grass fire started south of the creek. No one determined the cause, though a freight camp's cook fire was suspected, and it ran north with the wind through 4 miles of open range in less than 2 hours. The fire reached Fallner's lumberyard at mid-afternoon. The yard was a collection of frame sheds and open stacks of pine and cedar, arranged for access and sales, not for fire defense. Dry boards stacked in the open air, tar paper roofs on the sheds. Sawdust and shavings drifted against the base of every structure. The yard was fuel arranged in the shape of a business. The fire did not burn the whole yard. The wind shifted at the last quarter mile, and the main front passed east of the building, but a tongue of flame reached the south shed, where dry weeds had collected against the base of the stacked boards, the same kind of weeds that Warren raked from his stone cavity every evening. The weeds caught, the baseboards caught, the shed wall caught. By the time men arrived with buckets and wet blankets, the south shed was burning from the bottom up, and the boards inside were smoking. They saved most of the lumber. They lost the shed and its contents, perhaps $40 worth of stock, a serious loss for a business that operated on margins and credit. Fallner stood in the ash and watched the frame blacken and did not speak. Warren's shack, a mile and a half north, received the same fire's edge. A line of burning grass reached the claim from the southeast and hit the stone wall's base. The stone did not burn. The weeds in the gap. Warren had raked them 3 days earlier, but a few wisps remained, smoldered briefly, and went out, because there was not enough fuel in the cleared cavity to sustain flame. The grass outside the wall burned to the stone and stopped, because stone does not catch fire and the gap behind it held nothing but air. Warren lost a section of reed mat on the roof. The fire's heat dried it past its tolerance, and he pulled it down before it caught. He lost a wooden bucket that had been sitting against the outside of the east wall. He lost nothing else. The contrast was visible from the road. Fallner's south shed, gone. Warren's shack behind its stone ring, standing. Not because the stone was fireproof in any engineered sense, but because Warren's habit of raking the cavity, Tollef's insistence, born from the May wind that had packed the gap with tumbleweed, had removed the fuel that a grass fire needed to reach the wood. Fallner came to Warren's claim 2 days after the fire. He did not come to apologize. He did not come to learn. He came because his yard was damaged and his credit was thin, and he needed to see, with his own eyes, the thing he had spent a year mocking. He stood at the west wall and looked at the scorched grass line where the fire had stopped. He looked at the stone face, blackened at the base from smoke but structurally unchanged. He looked at the cleared cavity, visible through the base vents, empty of the debris that had fed the fire at his own yard. Warren came to the door and said nothing. He waited. Fallner was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I called it a fence because I could not sell it." It was not an apology. It was not remorse. It was a confession of motive, delivered in the flat voice of a man who understood that the gap between what he had mocked and what he had sold was the same gap that separated a standing building from a burning one. He had seen the wall as a commercial threat and treated it as a joke, and the prairie had answered him in a language that did not negotiate. Warren said, "The gap needs to be clear. If you had raked the weeds from your shed base, the fire might not have caught." Fallner looked at him. "That is not a stone wall." "No," Warren said. "It is the same principle. Keep fuel away from the thing you want to protect. Air, space, distance. The wall just makes the distance permanent." Fallner left without buying anything, without asking anything, without offering anything. He walked back to his wagon and drove south, and Warren watched him go and felt nothing that resembled triumph. Fallner had lost a shed and $40 of stock. Warren had lost a bucket and a reed mat. The difference was not intelligence or character. The difference was 6 inches of air and the habit of raking. Lydia Renner moved to the claim in the summer of 1895. She did not move as a wife. She moved as a teacher whose quarters behind the schoolhouse had become intolerable after the lean-to's roof began leaking, and whose closest available room was the one Warren offered because his shack had the only working shade system in the county, and Lydia had nowhere else to go that would not compromise her position. She slept on a cot behind a curtain that Elsie helped her hang. Warren slept on the floor on the other side. It was not romantic, it was practical, and the practicality was the foundation of everything that followed, because Warren and Lydia learned to share a 12 by 16-foot room the way 2 people learn to share a workspace, by being precise about boundaries and generous about labor. Lydia taught at the schoolhouse during the day and returned in the evening and helped Warren with the diagrams. She was better at drawing than he was, and she was better at explaining than he was, and she was better at organizing the visits that came with increasing frequency as the second summer approached and settlers remembered what the first summer had done to their buildings. She also challenged him. Warren was inclined to understate the wall's effectiveness, to say, "It helps some," when the data showed it helped significantly to say, "The roof is still a problem," when the roof solution was already working. Lydia pushed him to be specific. "How much cooler?" she asked one evening, reviewing the temperature slate. "Some. Depends on the day." The slate says 8 degrees on the west wall during the hottest week. It says 10 degrees on the south wall during the afternoon peak. Those are not some. Those are numbers. Use them. Warren looked at her. She looked back. She held the slate the way she held a pencil, firmly, with the expectation that the thing in her hand would produce something useful. 8 to 10 degrees, Warren said, on the shielded walls, less on calm days, more when the wind pushes the convection. Better, Lydia said. She wrote the numbers on the diagrams. She added them to the schoolhouse lessons. She made the children calculate. If the unshaded wall reads 102 and the shaded wall reads 94, what is the difference? 8 degrees. What makes the difference? The space. What moves through the space? Air. What does the air carry? Heat. Where does the heat go? Up, and out. The children learned it as arithmetic. They would remember it as principle. And the principle would outlast the wall because walls settle and stones shift, but the knowledge that a gap of moving air reduces heat transfer does not erode. Warren and Lydia married in September of 1895, under the shade of the west wall, in a ceremony attended by Clara Bixby, Martin and Abel, Dr. Kells, the store owner Webb, and 11 other people who had built some version of the wall on their own claims. Elsie, who was 10 and a half and had opinions about everything now, read the temperature slate aloud as the ceremony ended. Outside 94, inside 86. The wall sends its regards. People laughed. It was the right kind of laughter, the kind that comes from recognition, not mockery. The same stones that had been called a paranoid rock fence were now the backdrop for a wedding. The same gap that Fallner had said would fill with snakes was clean and dry and whispering with warm air rising through it. The same man who had been told he was building a coffin was standing in his own shade with a wife and a niece in a community that had come to his yard not because they pitied him, but because he knew something worth knowing. The years after the wedding compressed the way years do when the crisis has passed and the life that follows is made of work rather than survival. Warren improved the shack, not the stone wall, the shack itself. He added a ceiling of split boards to trap a dead air layer below the roof. He replaced the worst of the pine wall boards with thicker stock bought from a yard in Hayes, not Fallner's. He built a proper door frame with Lydia's help and hung a door that closed without a gap at the bottom. The stone walls settled. Each spring, Warren walked the perimeter and checked the batter and reset stones that frost had shifted and repacked, harding where the filling had compressed. Each summer, the wall performed as it had the first year, hot on the outside, warm on the inside, air moving through the gap in a continuous slow breath that carried the sun's punishment upward and out. Elsie grew. She turned 11, 12, 13. She stopped carrying water in a lard pail and started carrying it in proper buckets that Warren bought with money earned from stonework, not wall building for hire, but quarry work, splitting fence posts and foundation stones for settlers who needed cut limestone and could not afford to hire a professional. Warren split stone the way Tolliff had taught him. Drill line, wedges, even taps, listen for the crack. He was not as good as Tolliff. He would never be as good as Tolliff. But he was good enough to earn $3 a week in the busy season, which was enough to keep flour in the bin and Elsie in school shoes. Lydia taught. She built the shade wall lesson into the regular curriculum, and children who had never felt the difference between a shielded wall and an exposed one learned the principle as theory before they experienced it as fact. Some of those children would build walls of their own in 10 years. Some would move to towns where the principle did not apply. But all of them would remember that heat travels through surfaces and air carries it away, and that knowledge would sit in their minds the way Warren's father's lesson had sat in his quiet, unexamined, waiting for the moment it became urgent. A wet year came in 1897. The drought broke. Rain filled the draws, and the wells rose, and the grass turned green in a way that made people stop and stare because they had forgotten what green looked like on the open plain. Warren planted an orchard, 6 apple trees, 4 plum sabbats, on the north side of the claim where the stone wall's residual warmth might protect the roots from late frost. 2 of the apple trees survived. The plums did not, but the 2 surviving trees grew in the shelter of the wall's influence, and in the 4th year they produced fruit, and Elsie ate an apple from a tree her uncle had planted on a claim everyone had said would kill them. Warren's cough never left. It lived in his chest the way the debt had lived on Faulkner's books. Always present, sometimes quiet, never resolved. Kells examined him twice a year and said the same thing each time. The lungs were scarred from the winter fever and the years of dust and stone grit, and the scarring would not reverse, and the cough would not stop, and Warren should avoid heavy labor in dusty conditions, which was like telling a stone worker to avoid stone. He worked anyway. The cough was the cost of the wall, and the wall was the cost of Elsie's life, and the arithmetic balanced even when the body did not. Tolef Asen died in Hayes in the winter of 1898. His daughter sent word by letter. The letter said he had died in his sleep, which was a kindness whether it was true or not, and that he had asked to be buried with his quarry tools, which was true because Tolef was a man who believed tools had earned the same rest as the hands that held them. Warren did not go to the funeral. The distance was too far for his lungs in winter. He stood at the west wall of his shack on the day the letter arrived and placed his hand on the stone face and felt the cold January limestone under his palm and thought about the old man's hands, the scars, the grip, the way he turned a stone to find its bed without looking, the way a reader finds a word without sounding it out. Tolef had known stone the way Warren's father had known heat, from the inside, through the hands, in a language that did not translate to explanation, but translated perfectly to action. Warren hung the stone hammer on the inside of the door, where it had hung since Tolef gave it to him. He touched the ash handle and felt the curve that Tolef's grip had worn into the wood, and he left it there, and he went back to work. Some losses do not announce themselves. They sit in the grain of a tool handle and in the silence of a morning when no one limps up the track. Warren did not speak about Tolef often. When he did, it was to say what Tolef would have said about a particular stone or a particular wall, and the words came out in Tolef's rhythm, short, blunt, addressed to the stone rather than the listener. Lydia understood this. She did not ask Warren to talk about his grief. She recorded Tolef's name on the schoolhouse slate beside the temperature readings, and she told the children that the man who had taught their community to build walls that breathed had died in Hayes, and that the walls he had helped build were still standing, and that this was what a legacy looked like, not a monument, but a method that outlasted the hand that shaped it. He swore Dorr lived out his years on the same claim north of Walnut Creek. The shack grew slowly, a room added to the east, a proper porch on the south built with stone piers and a cedar shake roof, a root cellar dug into the north slope with a stone-lined entry that stayed cool in August and above freezing in January. The stone wall settled and leaned and was rebuilt, section by section, year by year, the way Tolef had said a stone wall must be maintained, not as a finished thing, but as a continuous act. He never became wealthy. He never became famous. He became the man people called before building too close to the sun, and that reputation was worth more than either wealth or fame in a county where the summers kept coming and the buildings did not change unless someone changed them. Lydia kept the school slate with the first temperature readings until the chalk wore too faint to read, and then she copied the numbers onto paper and filed them in the schoolhouse desk. The readings were not science by any standard a university would recognize. They were evidence, gathered by a school teacher and a quarryman student and a 9-year-old girl with a lime wash stick, and the evidence said what the hand on the wall had always said: the space is what saves it. 12 families in Rush County built some version of the shade wall in the years following Warren's first summer. 4 built full wraps, 8 built partial screens, west walls, south walls, water trough shades, milk shelf shields. The method spread not as an invention with a name and a patent, but as a habit passed from neighbor to neighbor at the store and the wellhead and the schoolhouse, the way practical knowledge has always spread in places where survival is more urgent than credit. Warren died in 1907 on the claim, in the room behind the stone wall. His cough had worsened each year until the last winter took what the first winter fever had started. Lydia was beside him. Elsie, who was 22 and married to a school teacher in Hayes, came home for the burial. They put him in the ground on the north side of the claim, beside the apple trees he had planted in the wet year, in the shade of the wall he had built in the dry one. Tolliffe's hammer hung on the door. On the day Warren was buried, the August sun pressed against the west face of the stone wall, the way it had pressed every August since 1894. The outer stones were hot enough to sting a palm. Grasshoppers clicked in the dust along the base course. The air in the gap moved upward in its slow, steady draft, warm but not still, rising but not rushing, carrying the day's heat up and out through the open top the way it had carried it every day for 13 years. The pine boards behind the stone sat 6 inches from the burning face, shaded and quiet. The temperature inside the room 8 degrees below the temperature of the open air. They had laughed because he wrapped his house in stone. Chet Fallner had called it a paranoid rock fence, and the men on the road had slowed their wagons to watch, and someone had left a note on the door that said the sun could climb. The sun had climbed. It climbed every day. It would climb tomorrow and the day after, and every day until the stones fell, and the boards rotted, and the claim returned to grass. But the wall was still standing, and inside it, the air was still moving. And on the step of the shaded entry throat, Elsie's daughter, 3 years old, too young to understand anything except what her hands told her, pressed one palm to the hot outer stone and the other to the cool inner board and held them there, feeling the difference, the way her great-uncle had felt it in a lime yard in Missouri when his father's thumb found the gap and the heat could not follow. The space is what saves it,